Archaeology at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. And this semester, we decided to do our department talks series a bit differently and invite some of our external collaborators to contribute talks, and also invite colleagues from all over to listen and participate in discussions. So it's really great to see so many people jumping in on these talks, and we're happy to have you all here. So our department uses archaeological methods to answer questions about human history, especially how humans have transformed environments through technological and cultural processes. And obviously our species, Homo sapiens, is unique in our ability to use technology to shape environments and shape the selective pressures within environments. And so this talk series considers how many of the aspects that are considered unique to the evolution of Homo sapiens take root much earlier, potentially even in the early Pleistocene. So the next 3 sessions will be exploring the origins of technology and the relationship between human ancestors and the environments in which they evolved. Also, it's worth noting that this seminar series is part 1 of a 2-part series about how humans interact with landscapes and environments throughout the Pleistocene, and part 2 will deal with the middle and the later Pleistocene. And it's planned for the last week in January and the first 2 weeks in February. This hasn't been announced yet, but look out for more information on that if these talks are interesting to you. But for now, we're going to the early Pleistocene, and to kick off our talks today, we have Dr. Robert Padalano, followed by a talk by Arturo Cueva Temprana. And so I ask again that you check to make sure your microphone is muted during the talk. And then if you have questions, you can indicate that you have a question in the chat panel, and I'll call on people to ask their questions after the talk is over. So our first speaker is Robert Padalano, or as we know him in the department, Bob. So Bob earned his PhD in archaeology from the University of Calgary. His dissertation focused on the environmental context of the earliest Acheulean at Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, and how early humans effectively responded to different climate and environmental conditions roughly 1.7 million years ago. As a Max Planck postdoctoral research fellow in paleoenvironmental biomarkers, Bob investigates stable carbon and hydrogen isotopes of leaf wax biomarkers from archaeological and paleoenvironmental sediments. And he answers questions concerning the relationships between environmental processes, cultural change, and human subsistence strategies. So today, Bob's giving a talk titled Environmental Complexity and Human Origins in Eastern Africa Perspective. So I'm going to hand it over to Bob now. And remember, mute yourself, as I'm about to do.
Okay, thanks Emma for that great introduction. Welcome all of you. Really excited that there's so much interest in these talks. Huge response on social media, so it's really great to have you all here today. I just want to send a special thanks to Emma for organizing this session. I know it's been a lot of work getting things ready for the remainder of the fall and into next year, so thank you, Emma, for that. We have a great group of people presenting in this session coming up after me. So I'm fortunate enough to lead off this series by giving you roughly a 15-minute overview of some of the new and interesting environmental hypotheses associated with human evolution that have come to the forefront in the last few decades or whatever, and really where we are now for using the environment as sort of a backdrop of the influence on human evolution. So again, thank you all for coming, and let's get started. So today, humans, really in the most understated way I could possibly put it, we have left our mark on the planet. From the climate crisis to, loss in biodiversity, humans really have changed the face of the earth within the last 100 to 200 years at an alarming rate. And we see things like, amazing forest fires that are just sweeping through Western United States, massive deformation of the land for fossil fuel excavations, coral bleaching, heating of the oceans, things like that. So one of the things we're really interested in, as archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, or even anthropologists in general, is how we can use our discipline to tackle some of these crises that are popping up down the road. How can we look at, ancient human societies and sustainability practices to sort of mitigate some of the effects that we are bringing upon the planet? Today, however, what we want to really look at is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. How was it that changes in the environment or changes in climate sort of drove human evolution or influenced human evolution over the last 5-10 million years? And really, what made us human and what drove us to how we are today, so that we are now impacting the entire planet and beyond, where we have satellites orbiting the planet. We have archaeological sites on the moon and even Mars today. So really, how did we get to this point? Now, traditionally, going back to Charles Darwin and then really Raymond Dart in the 20s, the hypotheses that sort of led to humans being humans was that we had a change from a forested, dense environment that spread across Africa from east to west and sort of covered tropical Central Africa. And it was really that split up of going from a forested environment to a gradual opening where we have more of a grass-dominated and then a C4 grassland biome, specifically in East Africa, and how these changes in the landscape brought about physiological, morphological, and technological changes in humanity. Going back from our earliest Australopithecine ancestors up until modern humans. But of course we know that's not really the case, and environments in Africa are complex, and within a kilometer or so, and really the availability of water, we can have huge changes in vegetation structure going from a grassland to a dense forest, all within a relatively short distance. And we see this today with modern biomes throughout Eastern Africa. And we know that it's a bit more complex than just saying it opened up over the last 5-10 million years. East Africa opened up in terms of vegetation, and humans evolved to become what we are today. Because we know both human evolution is really complicated with all of our ancestors and all of the connections we have to species that are now extinct. And of course, tropical climates are very difficult to really pinpoint the changes in climate and changes in environment and what that meant for the impact on humans in the past. So today, what we're really going to sort of focus on is a few changes going back, well, even right here, we'll start maybe 25 or 30 million years ago, and going back to the Miocene, and how changes across Africa started these, influencing some of these evolutionary processes. So before rifting began in East Africa, and you can see it nicely here at our Rift Valley with some of the Great Lakes going all the way up from the Red Sea down into the Great Lakes region here, and then again on this side, we had rifting that began about 25-30 million years ago. And with rifting, we had mountain building, and a lot of this tectonic activity sort of changed convective and moisture processes coming across Central Africa. And today what we see is a much drier, much more open savanna, is sort of the typical term we typically use, savanna biome in eastern and northeastern Africa, whereas we look out here, it's still very tropical, dense vegetation. And some of the big differences we see now in this region is really chimpanzees and gorillas, our closest ancestors today, stay in the central and western part of Africa, whereas it's believed that humans, at least our earlier ancestors, Australopithecines, either evolved in these drier settings in the east or even in southern Africa. Today we'll focus mainly on a few regions, the Afar region, Awash, and Hadar in Ethiopia, the Turkana Basin in Kenya, and of course Oldupai Gorge in Tanzania. And we'll just look at a few case studies going back, 5 million years or so, and how differences in our environments, both kind of regional and more local, might have influenced some evolutionary change in our ancestors. So going back about 10 million years is really where we start to see the expansion of C4 grasses. So here in our left panel, we're sort of looking at the changes in relative abundance of C3 plants and C4 plants going back 25 million years. And our data is coming from deep sea drilling cores off the northeastern coast of Africa. And we're looking at plant wax biomarkers. So isotope values from the long chain N-alkanes or N-alkanoic acids that can be transported long distances by wind and water, deposited in the ocean, and then buried in ocean sediments. And now we come along with our ocean drill cores, and we can actually recover them and reconstruct past plant landscapes and hydrological activity. So what we're showing here is, from about 25 million to 10 million years ago, we mainly had C3 plants in northeastern Africa. And if you look down here, you can see our isotope values are in the -30 to -35 range. And if we look at our other panel, C3 plants typically average about -35 carbon-13 values, whereas C4 grasses and C4 plants are much lower, around the -20, 21, 22 average for their C3. And this has a lot to do with discrimination against 13C in the atmosphere, with C3 plants discriminating heavily against 13C during photosynthesis. And knowing that from modern plants and modern biomes, we can sort of reconstruct past landscapes with a little diagram down here based on the isotope values. And as you become more positive or enriched with our carbon-13C, it's sort of indicative of more C4 plants and an opening of the landscape. And that's exactly what you see happening starting about 10 million years ago with the expansion of C4 plants in East Africa. And we can sort of look at how changes in the environment over time correlate with some things like early bipedalism and early stone tool use and the emergence of the genus Homo, all within the last, 6 or so million years. Now, of course, going back, this really brought upon something that we call the Savannah Hypothesis. And we now know today that it's way more complicated than that. The Savannah Hypothesis is basically a dead concept for the emergence of many of these behaviors or physical traits that we see in humans. But basically, looking at that previous slide and the expansion of C4 grasses and some of the evidence that we had going back, really kind of had us propose the Savannah Hypothesis with Raymond Dart going back to 1925. And basically what it said was that with the opening of the landscape, it led to bipedalism, which then gave way to the ability to do other things like create stone tools or hunt or expand their diet and things like that. And for a long time, that was basically the idea for the general emergence of humans. But maybe going back to the 70s or early 80s, people started recognizing how complex East African environments and climate really are, and that just a simple change from an open landscape to a closed landscape doesn't really answer many of the questions we have in terms of human evolution. And one of our earliest examples of this goes back to Artificus Romanus, who lived about 5 million years ago or so, 4.5 to 5 million years ago. And it's one of the earliest facultative bipeds that we know, with really good evidence, really great fossil evidence. Hip morphology shows that this species was able to walk bipedally, even if it was just short distances, and it still had adaptations for living in trees with the long arms, large hands and feet, things like that. So using multiple proxies from plant and fauna remains and stable isotopes, we've been able to sort of reconstruct the past landscapes of this species that lived really when C4 grasses were expanding in East Africa. Now, Artipithecus, most of the fossil material, or maybe all of it, comes from Ethiopia in the Afar region. But basically, we've been able to show that, it lived in a dense gallery forest, along river courses with a lot of wetland and forest adapted species. So even, right away, we start to see that, open grasslands or open grassland environments maybe, weren't as important to the evolution of bipedalism, for example, that originally we thought. And then even as we look a bit later in time at Australopithecus anamensis and then even Afarensis, again, in Eastern Africa. A lot of the environmental data we see is coming from, or, indicating that they too lived in gallery forests alongside these other primates like colobus monkeys or galagos. And even their environments were a bit more complex. And we know that they were facultative, obligate bipeds at this time, and really this whole Savannah hypothesis doesn't really hold water anymore for our earliest species. And then of course when we get to the genus Homo, and especially Homo erectus, and yes, we definitely have really good evidence of opening of the landscape in East Africa, and the morphology suggests that they were able to run and walk long distances. So I won't say that grasslands weren't important in human evolution. It's just that this whole Savannah hypothesis, it's a little bit more complex than that, right? We have dynamic ecosystems, dynamic environments, dynamic climate, and all of these things were probably influencing, human adaptability in the region. So basically over the last 20, 25 years or so, even, 35 years now, a lot more hypotheses have been put forward to explain these adaptations in humans and human evolution and what made us human. And I won't go through all of them today just because of the timing, but we'll touch on a few of them. Mostly, climate variability, variability hypotheses, pulse climate. So basically looking at how changes between, resource-rich and resource-poor environmental settings sort of drove these adaptations in humans to develop new stones to acquire new stone tools to acquire new food resources and things like that. And whether or not it was periods of climate instability and poor resources, or climate stability and abundant resources that really started allowing for these developments in human evolution. Let's see if this actually plays. So basically over the last 2.6 million years, a lot of the changes we see in climate and then subsequently in environment in East Africa can be driven by orbital cycles. The way that, the planet Earth rotates around the sun, or it spins on its axis, or just the angle that it faces the sun. And these things actually change hydroclimate around East Africa, and can really influence rainfall patterns, the amount of rainfall, and then subsequent landscape organization. Starting about 800,000 years ago, however, these become less pronounced, and really it's the glaciation in the northern southern hemispheres that start driving aridity, humidity cycles in East Africa. But for our early stuff right now, we're really looking at changes in the orbital cycles. And what we see with that is here is a figure looking at the hydrogen isotope values, again, from plant waxes, and how those change in response to changes in Earth's orbit. And if we look towards sort of the top part of the figure, anytime we have, more depleted or more negative isotope values, hydrogen isotope values, it really suggests that it becomes a bit wetter in Eastern Africa. And this is a record from Lake Turkana going back about 2 million years. And when we get these periods of increased rainfall, you get expanded lakes and much more dense forest with presumably better resources for humans to acquire and survive in this region. The opposite of that, however, is when we get into these periods of more positive or enriched isotope values, and things start becoming a bit drier and resources become limited. And if we look at that, we can actually somewhat correlate some of these events to, the emergence of the Acheulean about 1.75 million years ago, sort of matches up with an aridity period. The extinction of Homo habilis, or the last appearance at least of Homo habilis, possibly lines up with, resource depleted period as well. But basically we have really great records coming from Eastern Africa, from Kenya, from off the coast of northeastern Africa, from Tanzania, looking at these hydroclimate changes in response to Earth's obliquity or precessional cycles. And what this means really is, and what was something that we're still looking at as, archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, is how these events, dictated or influenced these periods in human evolution, these really unique processes like the emergence of specific stone tool industries. And I love when this happens. I love when a paper comes out, a day or so within the time period of giving a talk. But yesterday there was a really cool announcement of a new specimen of Paranthropus from Drimmelen in South Africa that was just announced. And one of the really cool things that I took from this paper was, how they compared regional environmental or climatic records comparing the species from Drimmelen and Schwarzkranz to look at the differences, and not so much saying that the differences in species was related to sexual dimorphism or males lived in one area and females lived in another. No, they were actually saying that as climate changed quite a bit for the Schwarzkranz populations, which were a little bit younger, and things dried out a bit, you actually see changes in the morphology because they were probably acquiring resources that were a bit more difficult to chew, therefore, larger chewing muscles and larger sagittal crests because of these changes in the environment. So we can actually look at a study, again, looking at plant waxes off in the Limpopo River drainage in southeastern Africa, that we actually saw, about 2 million years ago, right around the time the Drimmelen DNH 155 was living, that we see a change going from, sort of a more negative in both. We have more negative values in both the carbon and more negative values in the hydrogen, which would mean, more abundant rainfall, probably more C3 plants, hopefully, or ideally greater resources. And then starting right about 2 million years ago, we see a huge drop or an enrichment in hydrogen and an enrichment in carbon, meaning that it probably became a bit drier in the region. And again, maybe food resources became a bit more scarce. And just in this, 400 or 500 kilometers away between Drimmelen and Schwarzkranz, you actually do see morphological differences in the Paranthropus species there. And it could have been ecologically related, these changes over short time frame driving these changes. And I think that's a really cool idea proposed in this paper that just came out yesterday. Now, one thing that we often do in paleoanthropology, archaeology is, and I thought Dr. Hugh Groka said it perfectly in a paper that he had come out a month or two ago. We also often say that climate is synonymous with environment, and that can be a problem because it's hard to get environmental specific records sometimes in these hominin habitats where a lot of our records might come from ocean cores or lake cores, so it can be difficult to get direct proxy records from an actual archaeological site. So therefore, we have to really look at how we can go from climatic change to environmental change and what that really means for human evolution. And another paper that came out a few weeks ago, looking at much younger in time, going back about 400,000 years, comparing the Middle Stone Age smaller tools to the earlier Acheulean that had sort of disappeared. And basically what they were looking at was how going back to a million to about 400,000 years ago, where the Acheulean was present in these environments where you had lakes, you had grassy woodlands, assuming abundant food resources, larger mammals, things like that. And then something happens environmentally, climatically, at about 400, 500,000 years ago, where you have complete tool replacement, 85% turnover in mammal communities going from larger to smaller body ungulates, and of course the replacement of the Acheulean by the MSA, and the appearance of what would assumably be Homo sapiens at this time, living in a fluctuating environment, going between woodlands and grasslands, with freshwater lakes becoming, shallower and deeper all through this time. And the idea is that as you get this resource variability resulting from, climatic changes, you see the development of new technologies or even Homo sapiens. And then basically one of the key takeaways from this was that the early evidence of this response, the appearance of the MSA, suggests that the fundamental aspects of human adaptability had already emerged by the time of our species origin about 300,000 years ago. And then that, basically allowed us to go and disperse, throughout Africa, from Africa, and then into the Middle East and stuff. However, in our last case study here, we're going to focus on Orbital Gorge in northern Tanzania, and focus on the Western Gorge, which, because of complexity in geology, hasn't had much focus in terms of research over the last 100 or so years. But we're going back to about 2 million years, following some of the oldest exposed geology in the entire gorge, going back to about 2.1 or so million years, 2.03 basically, after a volcanic eruption from the Ngorongoro crater highlands nearby. And right away, we see, through a combination of phytoliths and plant wax biomarkers and faunal isotopes and geology, we can really reconstruct this environment and see, after these volcanic eruptions, we have, for the first example down here, a post-eruptive fern meadow. And right away, at 2 million years, we have the earliest evidence of the Oldowan stone tool industry in all of Olduvai. And then it basically stays, throughout this sequence as the plant landscape rebounds and, woodlands and palms come in as you have changes in hydrology and resources become more abundant. And then again, we see at about 2 million years, another volcanic eruption, which basically is the start of bed 1, which is more famous from, the central part of the gorge. But again, right afterwards, we see a rebound in the environment, and humans colonize right away, or most likely Homo habilis colonize right away. And we basically see that throughout the entire sequence from this part of the gorge. And what we're showing is that even 2 million years ago, and probably before, so this isn't some adaptation that we see only with humans, like in that last case study, early hominins, Homo habilis, Paranthropus boisei, they were able to occupy heterogeneous, unstable environments early on. So this trait that we see is not unique to Homo sapiens. It goes much further back in time, and really adapting to extreme environments or unpredictable environments is a trait to our genus that maybe really, propelled the evolution of our species and ancestors. So we do see cultural remains associated with habitats from post-volcanic disturbances. And really, this is some of the earliest evidence of adaptations to geomorphological and ecological transformations in Eastern Africa. So just to basically sum up, we know that, sort of bringing it all together, environments in Eastern Africa were complex, and so is it human evolution. And I think what we really need to do now is look more at these individual habitat-specific archaeological sites to really reconstruct past environments and then compare it to the greater regional climate. I'm going to stop there. I think I went over my time by quite a bit. Sorry about that. I just want to say thank you all again for listening, and if you have questions, we could either do it now. Emma, I think you wanted to do it now, or I guess we can let Arturo go because I went a bit long. But thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Bob. No, that was great.